The Frostborns' Inheritance. Eowyn Aldrich had always loved the cold, though the cold had never loved her back. Until now. The river froze overnight. The sky darkened without warning. The villagers whispered of an ancient force waking beneath the ice. And then, at the heart of the storm, he stood silver-eyed, waiting. The frost remembers, he murmured, and it does not forgive. Chapter 1. The unsettling chill of eventide. The kettle whistled, a shrill, insistent sound that usually brought Eowyn a sense of comfort, a signal of warmth, and the promise of chamomile tea. Tonight, however, it grated on her nerves. The chill that had settled over the village of Oakhaven wasn't just the usual autumnal nip, it was a bone-deep cold that seeped into the very marrow, a premonition made manifest in frost-laced window panes and the unnaturally still air. Eowyn, at 57, had seen her share of harsh autumns, but this felt different. She poured the steaming water over the dried chamomile flowers, the fragrant steam momentarily warming her face. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, a woman etched with the lines of time and hardship, her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with silver, her eyes, a startlingly bright blue, holding a weariness that mirrored the gathering gloom outside. The death of her husband, Thomas, 5 years ago, had left a void that no amount of tea, knitting, or gardening could fill. He'd been the warmth to her inherent coolness, the steady oak to her sometimes prickly rose bush. Eowyn wrapped her hands around the warm mug, her gaze drifting to the garden outside. The roses, usually bursting with late-season blooms, were now withered, their petals brittle and brown, coated with a layer of unnatural frost. Even the hardy rosemary bushes seemed to shiver. It was the same unsettling stillness that had fallen over the river, the lifeblood of Oakhaven, usually a rushing, gurgling torrent. Yesterday, it had been flowing normally. This morning it was a sheet of solid ice, reflecting the bruised, gray sky like a mirror. A shiver, unrelated to the cold, traced its way down her spine. She'd always felt a strange connection to the cold, a paradoxical affinity for the season that most people dreaded. While others huddled by their fires, Eowyn found a peculiar solace in the crisp air, the stark beauty of a snow-covered landscape. But this cold felt hostile. She heard the floorboards creak behind her and turned to see Martha, her closest friend, entering the kitchen, her usually rosy cheeks pale and pinched. Martha, a woman of unwavering practicality and boundless good humor, looked genuinely frightened. "Bone," Martha began, her voice a trembling whisper. "Have you seen the river?" Eowyn nodded, her throat tight. "It's unnatural. Old Man Hemlock was down there this morning," Martha continued, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. He said he saw something in the ice. A shape. Moving." Eowyn scoffed, trying to dismiss the fear that was rapidly taking root. "Old Man Hemlock sees things all the time, Martha. He's been telling tales since we were girls." But even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. Hemlock, despite his eccentricities, had always been strangely attuned to the rhythms of nature. And his fear, palpable in the air, was infectious. "He said it was silver," Martha whispered, her eyes wide. "Like moonlight on snow." The mug slipped from Eowyn's grasp, shattering on the stone floor. The chamomile tea spread across the flagstones, the fragrant steam quickly dissipating in the oppressive chill. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through her chest. A feeling of recognition? No, that was impossible.
"Eowyn?
Are you all right?" Martha rushed to her side, her hand hovering over Eowyn's arm, hesitant to touch. Eowyn shook her head, trying to clear the sudden fog in her mind. I don't know. I felt strange." For a moment, Martha helped her up, her brow furrowed with concern. "You've been working too hard.
You need to rest."
Eowyn managed a weak smile. "Maybe you're right." But rest felt impossible. The unsettling chill had deepened, settling into her bones like a physical weight. The silence of the village was broken only by the occasional, frantic barking of a dog, a sound that did nothing to ease the growing unease. As dusk began to truly settle, Painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and ominous gray, Eowyn found herself drawn to the river. She told herself it was foolish, that she should stay inside, by the fire with Martha. But an unseen force, a primal pull, tugged at her, drawing her towards the frozen expanse. She wrapped herself in a thick woolen shawl, the familiar scent of lavender clinging to the fabric a small comfort in the face of the growing dread. The village was deserted, the houses dark and silent, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching darkness. Even the ever-present scent of wood smoke was absent, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the frozen river. As she approached the bank, the air grew colder, the frost clinging to her eyelashes, her breath clouding in front of her face. The river, a solid sheet of ice, stretched out before her, an otherworldly landscape under the darkening sky. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the frozen river, seemingly impervious to the cold. Tall and imposing, his silhouette was stark against the fading light. He was too far away for her to make out any details, but she could feel his presence, a powerful, magnetic force that both terrified and intrigued her. As she watched, he turned his head, as if sensing her presence. And even from this distance she saw them. His eyes. They shone with an unnatural, silver light, like twin moons reflecting on the ice. A shiver, different from the cold, ran through her. It was a shiver of what? Fear? Yes, but something else too. Something ancient. Something inevitable. He raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, and beckoned her forward. The ice groaned. Chapter 2. Whispers on the frozen wind. The ice groaned again, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in Eowyn's very bones. Her rational mind screamed at her to turn and run, to flee back to the relative safety of her cottage, to the comforting presence of Martha. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, her gaze locked on the figure across the frozen expanse. He hadn't moved, hadn't lowered his hand. He simply waited, a silent, silver-eyed sentinel in the gathering darkness. The wind, which had been eerily still, began to pick up, swirling around her, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and something else, something wilder, something untamed. It whispered through the bare branches of the trees lining the riverbank, a sibilant chorus that seemed to carry fragments of words, unintelligible yet undeniably beckoning. Come, Eowyn blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had she imagined it? The wind, the cold, the fear, it was all playing tricks on her mind. Yet, the figure remained, his silver eyes unwavering, his presence a palpable force across the ice. She took a tentative step forward, the frozen ground crunching beneath her boots. Then another. And another. With each step, the feeling of unease intensified, but so did a strange sense of inevitability. It was as if she were caught in a current, a powerful, unseen force pulling her towards the unknown. The air grew colder, the frost forming intricate patterns on her shawl, her breath forming white plumes in front of her face. The village, with its darkened houses and silent streets, seemed a distant memory, a world away from this frozen, otherworldly landscape. As she drew closer, she began to make out more details of the figure. He was tall, even taller than she had first thought, with broad shoulders and a posture that spoke of both power and grace. He wore clothes that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding ice and snow, a long coat of a silvery gray material, trousers of a similar hue, and boots that appeared to be made of some kind of dark, polished leather. But it was his face that held her captive. It was a face that seemed both ancient and ageless, carved from the very essence of winter. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, and a mouth that was set in a firm, unyielding line. His hair, the color of freshly fallen snow, was long and unbound, framing his face like a winter halo. And his eyes, those silver eyes, they seemed to pierce through her, seeing not just her outward appearance, but the very depths of her soul. She stopped a few feet away from him, the ice separating them like a fragile, shimmering barrier. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the faint crackling of the ice.
Who are you?
Eowyn finally managed to ask, her voice a trembling whisper that was almost lost in the wind. He didn't answer immediately. He simply studied her, his silver eyes intense and unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to resonate from the very ice beneath their feet. "I am he who is forgotten," he said, his voice carrying a weight of ages, a hint of sorrow, and something else, something that sent a shiver of both fear and excitement down her spine. "I am he who was betrayed." Eowyn frowned, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. Forgotten? Betrayed? I don't understand. A flicker of something amusement? Sadness?
Crossed his features. "You will," he said.
"In time. But why are you here? Why did you call me?" He tilted his head slightly, his silver eyes narrowing. "Did I call you? Or did you hear the call of your own blood?" Eowyn's breath caught in her throat. Her blood? What did he mean? She opened her mouth to ask, but he raised a hand, silencing her. "The Frost remembers," he said, his voice echoing the words he'd spoken earlier, the words that had haunted her dreams for weeks, though she hadn't known their origin until now.
"And it does not forgive."
He took a step closer, and Eowyn instinctively recoiled, her hand flying to her chest, where the strange pain had flared earlier. The ice between them seemed to thin, the barrier between them growing ever more precarious. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice softening slightly, a hint of warmth creeping into his tone. But the warmth was deceptive, like the sun on a winter's day, promising heat but delivering only a fleeting illusion. "Afraid?" Eowyn repeated, her voice trembling. "Of course, I'm afraid. You appear out of nowhere. The river freezes over, everything is wrong." He smiled then, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. Wrong? Or awakened? He reached out a hand, his long, slender fingers, tipped with nails that seemed to shimmer like ice, hovering just inches from her face. Eowyn flinched, but she didn't move away. She couldn't. She was trapped, caught between fear and a strange, compelling fascination. His fingertips brushed against her cheek, and a jolt of cold, so intense it felt like fire, shot through her. She gasped, her eyes widening, her body trembling. But it wasn't just cold. It was something else. A connection. A recognition. A memory? Images flashed through her mind, fragmented and fleeting: a snow-covered forest, a silver wolf howling at the moon, a woman with bright blue eyes, her face etched with sorrow, a whispered promise, a broken vow. What was that?" Eowyn whispered, her voice barely audible. He withdrew his hand, his silver eyes watching her intently.
"The past," he said. "Your past. And mine."
He turned away from her, his gaze sweeping across the frozen river, the darkened village, the ominous sky. "It is time," he said, his voice low and resolute. "Time for the curse to be broken. Or fulfilled." He looked back at her, his silver eyes locking with hers. "And you, Eowyn Aldrich, are the key." He turned and started to walk further out onto the river. The ice, impossibly, did not break. Chapter 3. A silver gaze across the ice. Eowyn watched him walk away, his figure receding into the swirling mist that was now rising from the frozen river. His words, "You, Eowyn Aldrich, are the key," echoed in her mind, a chilling pronouncement that left her both terrified and strangely exhilarated. The key to what? The curse he'd spoken of? What curse? She wanted to call out to him, to demand answers, to beg him to explain the strange images that had flashed through her mind, the feeling of recognition that had jolted through her when he'd touched her. But the words caught in her throat, frozen by the icy air and the overwhelming sense of destiny that had settled over her. The mist thickened, obscuring him completely, and for a moment, she was alone on the frozen riverbank, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind and the creaking of the ice. She felt a pang of loss. No, that was ridiculous. She didn't even know him. Yet, his departure left a void, a chilling emptiness that mirrored the frozen landscape around her. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her, her body shivering uncontrollably. The cold was no longer just a physical sensation, it was an emotional one, a reflection of the fear and uncertainty that gnawed at her. She needed to get back to the village, to the warmth of her cottage, to the comforting presence of Martha. But as she turned to leave, she saw something on the ice, a small, shimmering object that hadn't been there before. It lay a few feet from where the silver-eyed man had stood, reflecting the faint moonlight like a fallen star. Curiosity, stronger than fear, propelled her forward. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the frozen surface of the ice. The object was a ring, a delicate band of silver, intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to resemble frost formations. In the center, a single, small, ice-blue stone shimmered, catching the light like a frozen tear. She picked it up, the cold metal sending a jolt through her. It felt familiar, as if she had held it before long ago in another lifetime. Another wave of images flashed through her mind, a hand, slender and pale, wearing the same ring, a whispered vow, a broken promise, a feeling of profound loss. Eowyn. The sound of Martha's voice, sharp with fear and relief, broke the spell. Eowyn looked up, startled, to see her friend rushing towards her, her face pale and strained in the moonlight. Eowyn, what are you doing here? I've been looking everywhere for you. It's not safe. Eowyn quickly slipped the ring into her pocket, her heart pounding. She didn't want to explain, didn't want to share the strange events of the evening, not yet. Not until she understood them herself. I just needed some air, she said, her voice sounding weak and unconvincing, even to her own ears. Martha didn't look convinced. She scanned the frozen river, her eyes searching. Were you alone? Eowyn hesitated. Yes, she lied, the word feeling like a betrayal. Martha wrapped an arm around her, her touch warm and comforting. Come on, let's get you home. You're freezing. They walked back to the village in silence, the only sound their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. Eowyn could feel Martha's worried gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet her friend's eyes.
She felt changed,
as if the encounter on the ice had irrevocably altered something within her. Back in the cottage, Martha busied herself with building up the fire, her movements quick and efficient. The warmth of the flames slowly began to thaw Eowyn's frozen limbs, but the chill in her heart remained. Martha poured her a cup of hot tea, her brow furrowed with concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. Eowyn managed a weak smile. Something like that, she murmured, taking a sip of the tea. She longed to tell Martha everything, to share the burden of the strange events, the unsettling encounter, the mysterious ring. But she couldn't. A part of her, a primal instinct, told her to keep it secret, to protect the fragile, flickering flame of something that had been ignited within her. Later, after Martha had gone to bed, Eowyn sat by the dying embers of the fire, the silver ring clutched tightly in her hand. She turned it over and over, examining the intricate carvings, the shimmering stone. It felt alive, as if it held a power, a secret, waiting to be unlocked. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. And as she did, she felt it again, that jolt of recognition, that sense of connection. The images returned, sharper this time, more vivid: the snow-covered forest, the silver wolf, the woman with the blue eyes, and a man. A man with silver eyes, his face etched with both love and sorrow. She closed her eyes, her mind reeling. Who was this man? What was the curse he'd spoken of? And what was her role in all of this? She knew one thing for sure. Her life, her quiet, predictable life in Oakhaven, was over. Something ancient had awakened, something powerful and dangerous. And she, Eowyn Aldrich, was somehow caught in the middle of it. The feeling, the certainty, settled over her like the ice on the river, solid and inescapable. She looked out the window, at the frozen landscape, the silver moon hanging in the sky. A single wolf howled in the distance, a mournful, haunting sound that resonated deep within her soul. Chapter 4. The Frostborns' Touch. The howl lingered in the air, a primal echo that seemed to vibrate in Eowyn's very bones. Sleep was impossible. She tossed and turned, the sheets tangled around her legs, The images from the ring, the man's silver eyes, the chilling pronouncements, all swirling in her mind like a blizzard. Finally, she gave up, throwing back the covers and rising from the bed. The cottage was cold, despite the embers still glowing faintly in the hearth. She wrapped herself in a thick robe and went to the window, peering out at the frozen landscape. The moon, a silver disk in the inky sky, cast long, skeletal shadows across the snow-covered ground. The river, a ribbon of shimmering ice, snaked its way through the village, a silent testament to the unnatural chill that had gripped Oakhaven. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the ring, the silver cold against her skin. She held it up to the moonlight, the ice-blue stone shimmering with an inner light. As she gazed at it, she felt that familiar jolt, that sense of connection, of memory. It was stronger now, more insistent. She slipped the ring back onto her finger, the metal feeling strangely warm against her skin. The images returned, flooding her mind with a rush of sensation, the scent of pine and snow, the feel of the wind whipping through her hair, the sound of a wolf's howl, the warmth of a hand in hers, a man's hand. A hand with long, slender fingers, tipped with nails that shimmered like ice. His hand. Yoan gasped, her heart pounding against her ribs. She remembered holding his hand, walking with him through a snow-covered forest, the moonlight filtering through the bare branches of the trees. She remembered the warmth of his body next to hers, the feeling of safety that he emanated. She remembered love. But then the images shifted, darkened. She saw fear, betrayal, a whispered curse, a broken vow, and a profound, overwhelming sense of loss. She saw the man, his silver eyes filled with sorrow, his face etched with pain. She saw herself, younger, her hair of vibrant auburn, her eyes bright with a love that had been cruelly snatched away. Yoan pulled the ring off her finger, the sudden cessation of the images, leaving her feeling disoriented and bereft. She clutched the ring tightly in her hand, her mind reeling. What was happening to her? Was she losing her mind? Or was she remembering? A sudden sound of faint scratching at the window startled her. She turned, her heart in her throat, to see a pair of silver eyes staring back at her. For a moment, she thought it was him, the man from the river. But then, she realized it was a wolf. A large, silver-gray wolf, its fur shimmering in the moonlight, its eyes reflecting the same unnatural light as the man's. The wolf stood motionless, its gaze fixed on her, its presence both menacing and strangely familiar. It scratched at the window again, a soft, insistent sound. Yoan felt a strange compulsion to open the window, to let the wolf in. Her rational mind screamed at her to stay away, to call for Martha, to do anything but approach the wild creature. But her feet moved of their own accord, drawn towards the window by an unseen force. She reached out, her hand trembling, and unlatched the window. The cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow and something else. Something wild, something untamed, something familiar. The wolf stepped inside, its movements graceful and silent. It stood before her, its head held high, its silver eyes unwavering. It didn't growl, didn't bare its teeth. It simply waited. Yoan knelt down, her heart pounding, her hand reaching out tentatively. She touched its fur, the soft, thick coat surprisingly warm beneath her fingers. The wolf didn't flinch, didn't move away. It simply looked at her, its eyes filled with an intelligence, a knowing that sent a shiver down her spine. "You know him, don't you?" Yoan whispered, her voice barely audible. The wolf tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. Then, it let out a soft whimper, a sound that was both mournful and comforting. Yoan felt a sudden surge of understanding. She didn't know how, she didn't know why, but she knew that this wolf was connected to the man from the river, to the curse, to the memories that were flooding her mind. The wolf nudged her hand with its head, then turned and walked towards the door, its tail brushing against her leg. It looked back at her, its silver eyes urging her to follow. Yoan hesitated. It was madness, sheer madness, to follow a wild wolf into the frozen night. But she couldn't resist. The pull was too strong, the connection too profound. She had to know. She had to understand. She grabbed her shawl and followed the wolf out of the cottage, into the cold, silent darkness. The wolf loped ahead, easily navigating the snow. The ice reflected the moonlight, illuminating its path. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Forgotten Pact. The wolf led her through the deserted village, past the darkened houses and the silent, frozen gardens. The only sound was the crunch of their footsteps on the snow and the occasional whisper of the wind. Eowyn felt a strange sense of unreality, as if she were walking through a dream, a world both familiar and utterly alien. She followed the wolf without question, her fear replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew she had to go. She had to follow the wolf, to follow the thread of memory that was unraveling within her, to find the truth that lay hidden beneath the frozen surface of her life. They reached the outskirts of the village, the houses giving way to open fields, and then, finally, to the dark, looming presence of the ancient grove. The grove, a dense cluster of ancient oak and yew trees, had always been a place of mystery and folklore, a place where the villagers whispered of ancient spirits and forgotten magic. Eowyn had always avoided it, especially at night. But tonight, she felt drawn to it, pulled by the same unseen force that had led her to the river, to the man, to the wolf. The wolf entered the grove without hesitation, its silver fur blending seamlessly with the shadows. Eowyn followed, her heart pounding, her breath clouding in the frigid air. The trees, their branches bare and skeletal, seemed to reach out to her, their shadows dancing in the moonlight like ghostly figures. The air in the grove was even colder, the silence deeper, more profound. The scent of pine and damp earth was heavy in the air, mingled with something else, something ancient, something primal. Eowyn felt a shiver run down her spine, a feeling of being watched. The wolf stopped in a small clearing at the center of the grove, a space where the moonlight filtered through the branches, illuminating a circle of ancient standing stones. The stones, weathered and worn, were covered in intricate carvings, symbols that Eowyn didn't recognize, but that felt familiar. The wolf sat down before one of the stones, its silver eyes fixed on Eowyn. It let out a soft whimper, a sound that seemed to echo through the silent grove. Eowyn approached the stone, her hand reaching out tentatively. She touched the cold, rough surface, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. As she did, she felt that familiar jolt, that surge of memory. Images flooded her mind, sharper, clearer than before, a gathering of people, dressed in ancient clothing, standing in this very clearing, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. She saw a young woman, her hair of vibrant auburn, her eyes bright with love, standing before a man with silver eyes. She saw them exchange vows, their hands clasped together, a silver ring shimmering on the woman's finger. She saw a ritual, a pact being made, a promise sworn to the ancient spirits of the grove, a bond forged between two souls, a bond that was meant to last for eternity. But then the images shifted, darkened. She saw betrayal, a broken vow, a curse unleashed, a separation that ripped through the very fabric of time and space. She saw the man, his silver eyes filled with anguish, his face etched with despair. She saw the woman, her heart shattered, her spirit broken, fading away into the shadows. Eowyn gasped, her hand recoiling from the stone. She stumbled back, her legs weak, her mind reeling. She remembered everything. She was that woman. The woman who had made the pact, the woman who had been betrayed, the woman who had lost everything. And the man with the silver eyes, he was her soulmate, the one she had loved, the one she had lost, the one who had been cursed because of her. The wolf let out a low growl, its eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and warning. Eowyn looked at the wolf, her eyes widening in understanding. He remembers, too, she whispered, her voice trembling. The wolf nodded, its head held high. The curse, Eowyn continued, her mind racing. It wasn't just his curse. It was ours. The images she'd been seeing weren't just random flashes of the past. weren't a product of overactive imagination. They were fragmented memories, her own and his, triggered by the ring and the sudden unfreezing of a magic long dormant. She understood now. The sudden freeze, the man's appearance, the wolf, it was all connected. The curse, dormant for centuries, had been awakened. And she, Eowyn Aldrich, the reincarnation of the woman who had made the pact, was the key to breaking it or fulfilling it. She looked at the standing stones, at the intricate carvings, at the ancient symbols. She felt a surge of power coursing through her, a connection to the ancient spirits of the grove, to the magic that had been dormant for so long. The wind picked up, swirling the snow. Eowyn took a ragged breath. Chapter 6. The Village of Withering Hope. The wind howled through the ancient grove, a mournful cry that echoed Eowyn's own inner turmoil. The weight of the recovered memories, the realization of her past life, the burden of the curse had all pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. But beneath the fear and the sorrow, a flicker of determination ignited within her. She wouldn't be broken. She wouldn't let the curse consume her or him. The wolf, sensing her shift in resolve, nudged her hand with its head, its silver eyes filled with a quiet understanding. It was a silent offer of support, a promise of companionship in the daunting task that lay ahead. She returned to the village with the first rays of dawn painting the sky in hues of pale pink and gray. The village was still shrouded in an unnatural chill, the river a solid sheet of ice, the houses dark and silent. But as she walked through the deserted streets, she noticed something different. The fear that had permeated the air the previous day was still present, but it was tinged with something else. A faint glimmer of hope? She saw it in the way the villagers peeked out from behind their curtains, their eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. She saw it in the small offerings of food and flowers that had been left on doorsteps, a silent plea to whatever spirits might be listening. She saw it in the way Martha rushed out to greet her, her face etched with relief and worry.
Eowyn,
"Where have you been?" "I was frantic. You were gone all night." Martha's voice was sharp with concern, her hands gripping Eowyn's arms. Eowyn managed a weak smile. I had to go," she said, her voice evasive. She still couldn't bring herself to tell Martha everything. Not yet. The truth was too unbelievable, too overwhelming. Martha searched her face, her eyes filled with suspicion. "Go where?" "Eowyn, something's happened. You're different." Eowyn sighed. "I know," she said. I can't explain it yet, Martha. But I need your help." Martha's expression softened. Despite her apprehension, her loyalty to Eowyn was unwavering. "Anything," she said. "You know that." "The villagers," Eowyn began, her gaze sweeping across the silent houses. "They're afraid. But they sense something. They know something's changed." "Old Man Hemlock has been talking," Martha said, her voice low. "He says the Frostborn has returned. He says it's a curse, a punishment for the sins of our ancestors." Eowyn nodded. "He's not entirely wrong," she said. "But it's not a punishment. It's a consequence. A broken pact. A forgotten promise." She explained to Martha, as best as she could without revealing the full truth of her past life, about the ancient magic, the curse, the need to break it. She spoke of the man, the silver-eyed stranger, and the wolf, his silent companion. She spoke of the need to find a way to restore balance, to appease the ancient spirits, to bring warmth back to the village. Martha listened intently, her initial skepticism slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance. She had always known there was something different about Eowyn, something otherworldly. And the unnatural chill that had gripped the village, the frozen river, the whispers of the Frostborn, it all pointed to something beyond the realm of ordinary explanation. "What can we do?" Martha asked, her voice filled with a newfound determination. Eowyn looked at her, her heart filled with gratitude for her friend's unwavering support. "We need to gather the villagers," she said. "We need to tell them a story of the past, a story of hope." They spent the rest of the morning going from house to house, talking to the villagers, sharing Eowyn's carefully crafted narrative. She spoke of an ancient pact, a broken promise, a curse that had fallen upon the land. She spoke of the need for forgiveness, for reconciliation, for a renewed commitment to the ancient ways. She spoke of the possibility of redemption, of a chance to restore balance and bring warmth back to their lives. The villagers listened, their faces a mixture of fear, hope, and bewilderment. Some were skeptical, dismissing it as an old wives' tale. Others were more receptive, their hearts stirred by Eowyn's passionate plea. But slowly, gradually, a sense of unity began to emerge, a shared desire to overcome the curse that had fallen upon their village. By evening, they had gathered in the village square, a small crowd huddled together against the cold. The frozen river, a shimmering expanse of ice, reflected the light of the setting sun, casting an ethereal glow over the scene. Eowyn stood before them, the wolf by her side, its silver eyes gleaming in the fading light. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent square. The snow began to softly fall, a stark contrast to the story of ice being told. Chapter 7. Shadows in the Ancient Grove. Eowyn's voice resonated through the village square, weaving a tale of ancient magic, broken promises, and a love that transcended time. She spoke of the Frostborn, not as a vengeful spirit, but as a being trapped by a curse, a soul yearning for release. She spoke of the villagers' ancestors, their connection to the land, their responsibility to uphold the ancient pact. She spoke of hope, of the possibility of breaking the curse, of restoring warmth and balance to their world. The villagers listened, captivated by her words, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches and lanterns. The falling snow, soft and gentle, seemed to create a veil of intimacy, drawing them closer together, uniting them in a shared purpose. Even the skeptical faces began to soften, their eyes reflecting a glimmer of belief, a spark of hope. As Eowyn spoke, she felt a surge of power coursing through her, a connection to the ancient spirits of the grove, to the magic that was awakening within her. She felt the presence of the Frostborn, his silent energy mingling with hers, a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. But as the night deepened, a shadow fell over the gathering. A group of men, led by a burly, boisterous farmer named Silas, stepped forward, their faces hardened with suspicion and distrust. Silas had always been a doubter, a man who scoffed at the old tales, who believed only in what he could see and touch. "Enough of these fairy tales," Silas shouted, his voice booming across the square. "This is all nonsense. There's no curse, no Frostborn. It's just a cold spell, a natural phenomenon." A murmur of dissent rippled through the crowd. Some of the villagers, swayed by Silas's forceful words, began to shift uneasily, their newfound hope flickering like a dying flame. Eowyn stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "It is not nonsense, Silas," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The frost is a sign, a warning. We have forgotten the old ways. We have broken the pact with the land. And now we must pay the price." "Price?" Silas scoffed. "What price? Are you suggesting we sacrifice something? Someone?" His eyes, dark and menacing, narrowed as he looked at Eowyn, then at the wolf by her side. A gasp of fear went through the crowd. The suggestion of sacrifice, even unspoken, was a terrifying prospect. The ancient tales were filled with stories of such offerings, of desperate attempts to appease angry spirits. Eowyn shook her head.
"No," she said.
"No sacrifice of blood, but a sacrifice of fear, of doubt, of selfishness. We must offer our commitment, our willingness to change, our dedication to restoring balance." Silas laughed, a harsh, derisive sound. "You're mad, Eowyn. You've been spending too much time with that beast." He gestured towards the wolf, and listening to Old Man Hemlock's ramblings. The wolf growled, a low, menacing sound that sent a shiver through the crowd. But Eowyn placed a calming hand on its fur, her eyes fixed on Silas. "The wolf is a guide, Silas," she said. "A messenger. It is connected to the Frostborn, to the ancient spirits of the grove. It is here to help us, not to harm us." Help us? Silas sneered. By leading us into the woods? By scaring us with its wild eyes? He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I don't trust you, Eowyn. I don't trust that wolf. And I don't trust this Frostborn. I think you're all in league with him, plotting something against the village. His words, fueled by fear and suspicion, ignited a spark of paranoia in the crowd. Some of the villagers began to murmur amongst themselves, their eyes darting nervously between Eowyn and Silas. Eowyn felt a surge of frustration, of despair. She had come so close, had managed to instill a glimmer of hope in their hearts. But Silas's words, his fear-mongering, were threatening to undo all her efforts. Suddenly, the wolf let out a sharp bark, its eyes fixed on the entrance to the ancient grove. Eowyn followed its gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw it too. A figure, standing in the shadows of the trees, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. He stepped forward, into the faint light of the moon filtering through the branches. It was him, the Frostborn. His silver eyes, gleaming in the darkness, were fixed on Eowyn. A hush fell over the village. Chapter 8. The Price of Warmth. His presence was like a sudden drop in temperature, a palpable wave of cold that washed over the village square. The villagers gasped, their breath clouding in the frigid air, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Even Silas, for once, seemed speechless, his bravado momentarily shattered by the sheer power emanating from the figure before them. The Frostborn stood motionless, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, his silver eyes lingering on each face, as if assessing their worth, their intentions. He wore the same silvery gray clothes he'd worn on the ice, the fabric seeming to shimmer in the moonlight, blending seamlessly with the surrounding shadows. He was both terrifying and magnificent, a being from another realm, a living embodiment of winter's power. Eowyn felt a surge of relief, mixed with apprehension. She had known he would come, had felt his presence throughout the evening. But seeing him now, in the flesh, surrounded by the fearful villagers, was a different experience altogether. It was a confirmation of everything she had said, a validation of her claims. But it was also a risk, a gamble. She had no control over him, no assurance that he would cooperate with her plan. He took a step forward, and the villagers instinctively recoiled, their fear palpable. The wolf, however, remained by Eowyn's side, its body tense, but its eyes unwavering. You have spoken of a curse, the Frostborn said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. Of a broken pact, of a forgotten promise. His words, echoing Eowyn's earlier narrative, sent a shiver through the crowd. They were no longer just words, they were a reality, a tangible force that hung heavy in the air. Silas, recovering his composure, stepped forward, his face a mask of defiance. Who are you? He demanded, his voice trembling slightly despite his attempt at bravado. What do you want? The Frostborn turned his gaze to Silas, his silver eyes piercing and unreadable. I am he who was forgotten, he said, his voice echoing his earlier words to Eowyn. I am he who was betrayed. I am the keeper of the balance. Balance? Silas scoffed. You call this balance? Freezing our village, threatening our lives? The Frostborn's expression didn't change. The balance has been disrupted, he said. The pact has been broken. And there is a price to be paid. A murmur of fear went through the crowd. The price. The words hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder of the ancient tales, of the sacrifices that had been made to appease angry spirits. Eowyn stepped forward, her heart pounding. She had to intervene, to prevent the situation from escalating, to guide the Frostborn towards the path of reconciliation, not retribution. The price is not what you think, she said, her voice clear and strong, addressing both the villagers and the Frostborn. It is not a sacrifice of blood, but a sacrifice of self, of fear, of doubt, of the unwillingness to change. She turned to the Frostborn, her eyes pleading. They are willing to make amends, she said. They are willing to remember, to honor the ancient ways. They are willing to restore the balance. The Frostborn studied her, his silver eyes intense and unreadable. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her sincerity. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the soft crackling of the torches. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Willingness is not enough," he said. "There must be proof. A demonstration of their commitment. A tangible offering." The villagers exchanged nervous glances. What kind of offering did he mean? What would be enough to appease him? To break the curse? Eowyn took a deep breath. She had anticipated this, had prepared for it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver ring. The one she had found on the ice, the one that held the key to her past, to their shared destiny. She held it up, the ice-blue stone shimmering in the moonlight. "This," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is the offering. A symbol of the broken pact, a reminder of the forgotten promise, and a key to restoring it." She walked towards the Frostborn, her steps slow and deliberate. The villagers watched her, their breath held captive in their chests, their eyes fixed on the ring. She reached out, her hand trembling, and offered it to him. A visible ripple went through his body. Chapter 9. Beneath a Cursed Moon. He looked at the ring, his silver eyes widening slightly, a flicker of something passing across his features. It was a fleeting expression, gone so quickly that Eowyn almost thought she'd imagined it. But she knew, she felt it in her bones, that the ring held a significance for him, a power that went beyond its physical form. It was a link to their past, a symbol of their broken bond, a key to their shared destiny. He reached out, his long, slender fingers hovering over the ring, hesitant to touch it. Eowyn held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The fate of the village, of their future, hung in the balance, suspended between her outstretched hand and his. Finally, he took the ring, his fingers closing around it, the cold metal meeting his skin. A jolt of energy, visible as a faint shimmer of light, passed between them, connecting them, binding them together. Eowyn gasped, her knees almost giving way beneath her. The Frostborn staggered slightly, his eyes closing for a moment, as if he were absorbing the power, the memories, the emotions that the ring contained. When he opened his eyes, they were no longer cold and distant, they were filled with a warmth, a sadness, a recognition. He looked at Eowyn, his gaze intense and unwavering, and she saw, for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the man he had been, the man she had loved, before the curse had taken hold. "Alara," he whispered, his voice a barely audible breath, the sound carrying a weight of ages, a depth of emotion that sent shivers down Eowyn's spine. It was her name from their past life, the name he had called her in her dreams, in the fragmented memories that had flooded her mind. Hearing it now, spoken by him, in this reality, was like a key unlocking a door in her heart, a door that had been closed for centuries. "Yes," she whispered back, her voice trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's me." The villagers watched in stunned silence, their fear giving way to a sense of awe, of wonder. They didn't understand the full significance of the exchange, the depth of the connection between Eowyn and the Frostborn, but they sensed that something profound was happening, something that transcended their understanding. The Frostborn held the ring up to the moonlight, the ice-blue stone shimmering with an inner light. He closed his eyes, his face etched with concentration, and began to chant, his voice low and resonant, the words ancient and unintelligible, yet somehow familiar. Eowyn felt a surge of power coursing through her, a connection to the ancient spirits of the grove, to the magic that was flowing through the Frostborn, through the ring, through her. She felt the earth beneath her feet tremble, the air around them crackle with energy. The falling snow intensified, swirling around them like a vortex, creating a magical, otherworldly scene. The villagers gasped, their eyes wide with amazement and fear. Even Silas seemed to be caught up in the moment, his skepticism momentarily forgotten. The chanting continued, growing in intensity, reaching a crescendo. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was profound, absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of the wind. The Frostborn opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. The cold that had emanated from him was gone, replaced by a warmth, a gentle energy that seemed to soothe the very air around them. "The pact is renewed," he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent square. "The balance is restored." A collective sigh of relief swept through the villagers, their fear and tension dissolving like ice melting in the sun. They looked at each other, their faces lit up with joy, with relief, with a newfound sense of hope. The snow began to slow, the clouds parting to reveal a sky filled with stars, the moon shining brightly, casting a silver glow over the village. The air, though still crisp, no longer held the biting chill that had gripped them for so long. The Frostborn turned to Eowyn, his silver eyes filled with a tenderness that she had never seen before. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, his gaze lingering on her face. Eowyn smiled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We did it," she whispered. "Together." He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers no longer cold, but warm, human. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a feeling of connection, of love that transcended time and space. He turned to face the odd villagers. Chapter 10. The River's Frozen Lament. But the joy was short-lived. As the villagers began to celebrate, their cheers echoing through the square, a sudden, sharp crack shattered the celebratory atmosphere. It came from the river, a sound like thunder, echoing through the valley. Everyone turned towards the sound, their smiles fading, replaced by expressions of renewed fear. The ice on the river, which had remained stubbornly solid despite the restored balance, was beginning to fracture. Large cracks snaked across its surface, spider webbing outwards with alarming speed. The sound grew louder, a groaning, grinding noise that set teeth on edge. The Frostborn's expression turned grim. He looked at Eowyn, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of concern and regret. "The curse, it is not fully broken," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "There is something else, something holding it in place." Eowyn's heart sank. She had thought, they had all thought, that the renewal of the pact, the offering of the ring, would be enough. But the fracturing ice, the ominous sounds, were a clear indication that something was still amiss. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What else do we need to do?" The Frostborn shook his head.
"I do not know," he said.
"But the river, it holds the key. It is the source of the curse, and the source of its release." He turned his gaze towards the river, his eyes narrowed, as if trying to penetrate the ice, to see what lay beneath. The cracking intensified, the groaning growing louder, more insistent. Pieces of ice began to break off, crashing into the water below with a deafening roar. The villagers, their initial joy replaced by renewed terror, began to back away from the riverbank, their eyes wide with fear. Silas, his face pale and strained, pointed a trembling finger at the Frostborn. "You lied," he shouted, his voice hoarse with fear and anger. "You said the curse was broken. You said we were safe." The Frostborn ignored him, his attention focused entirely on the river. Eowyn stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Silas's arm. "He didn't lie, Silas," she said, her voice firm despite her own growing fear. "He renewed the pact. But something else is interfering. Something we don't understand." "What do we do?" Martha asked, her voice trembling, her eyes fixed on the fracturing ice. Eowyn looked at the Frostborn, her eyes pleading for guidance. He met her gaze, his expression grave. "We must go to the river," he said. "We must find the source of the disruption. We must face whatever is there." The prospect was terrifying. The river, even in its normal state, was a powerful force of nature. Now, with the ice fracturing and the water churning, it was a deadly, unpredictable entity. But Eowyn knew they had no choice. They had come this far, had risked everything. They couldn't give up now. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. The wolf, which had been standing silently by her side, nudged her hand with its head, its silver eyes filled with a quiet understanding. It was a silent offer of support, a promise of companionship in the dangerous task ahead. The Frostborn nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Together," he said, his voice echoing her earlier words. He turned and began to walk towards the river, his steps slow and deliberate. Eowyn followed, the wolf by her side, her heart pounding in her chest. The villagers watched them, their faces a mixture of fear, hope, and awe. They were entrusting their fate, their lives, to these two unlikely figures, a woman who had rediscovered her past, and a man who was the embodiment of winter itself. As they reached the riverbank, the ice groaned again, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air. A large section of ice broke off, crashing into the water with a deafening roar, sending a spray of icy water into the air. The river was awakening, and it was angry. The current swirled. Chapter 11. A dance of fear and desire. The churning water, dark and icy, reflected the moonlight, creating an unsettling, almost hypnotic effect. Eowyn felt a wave of fear wash over her, a primal instinct to flee, to escape the dangerous, unpredictable force before her. But she stood firm, her gaze fixed on the Frostborn, drawing strength from his presence, from his unwavering resolve. He didn't hesitate. He stepped onto the fracturing ice, his movements surprisingly graceful, as if he were walking on solid ground. The ice groaned beneath his weight, cracks spreading outwards, but it held. He turned and looked at Eowyn, his silver eyes beckoning. "Come," he said, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. Eowyn took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She placed a hand on the wolf's fur, drawing comfort from its warmth, its silent support. Then she stepped onto the ice. It was like stepping into another world. The cold was intense, biting through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. The ice shifted and groaned beneath her feet, threatening to give way at any moment. She felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to turn back, to run to safety. But she forced herself to keep moving, her gaze locked on the Frostborn, her steps mirroring his. He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly warm, sending a jolt of electricity through her. His grip was firm, reassuring, a lifeline in the swirling chaos. He pulled her closer, his body shielding her from the spray of icy water, his presence a beacon of warmth in the frigid air. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice soft, his breath warm against her ear. "I will not let you fall." His words, his touch, his presence, they calmed her fear, replaced it with a strange, exhilarating sensation. It was a feeling she had known before, long ago in another lifetime. A feeling of connection, of trust, of love. They moved slowly, carefully, navigating the treacherous ice, their bodies close, their movements synchronized. It was like a dance, a delicate, dangerous dance between fear and desire, between life and death. The ice cracked and groaned around them, the river churning beneath them, but they held on to each other, their bond a fragile thread of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Eowyn felt a strange sense of exhilaration mixed with the fear. It was as if the danger, the proximity to the Frostborn, the raw power of the river, were awakening something within her, something primal, something passionate. She remembered the images from the ring, the memories of their past life, the love they had shared, the bond they had forged. And she realized, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that those feelings were not just memories, they were still alive, still burning brightly beneath the surface of her conscious mind. She looked at him, at his silver eyes, his strong jawline, his lips that were set in a firm, determined line. And she saw, not just the Frostborn, the keeper of the balance, but the man she had loved, the man she had lost, the man she had found again. He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the same intensity, the same longing. He saw it too. He felt it too. The connection, the love, the undeniable pull that had drawn them together across time and space. Suddenly, a large section of ice broke off, right in front of them, creating a gaping chasm of churning water. Eowyn gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She lost her footing, slipping on the treacherous ice. She would have fallen, would have been swept away by the icy current, if not for the Frostborn's quick reflexes. He tightened his grip on her hand, pulling her closer, his other arm wrapping around her waist, holding her securely against him. Their bodies collided, the impact sending a jolt of electricity through her. For a moment, they were suspended in time, their faces inches apart, their breath mingling in the frigid air. He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a fire that she had never seen before. It was a fire that mirrored her own, a burning desire that transcended the danger, the fear, the curse that had separated them for so long. He leaned in. Chapter 12. The Heart's Uncharted Territory. His lips were close, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the surrounding air. The roar of the river faded into the background, the cracking of the ice a distant echo. All that existed was the intensity of his gaze, the magnetic pull between them, the undeniable force that had drawn them together across centuries. But just as their lips were about to meet, a surge of icy water erupted from the chasm in front of them, a towering wave that crashed over them, drenching them in freezing spray. Eowyn gasped, her body shivering uncontrollably, the sudden shock momentarily breaking the spell. The Frostborn held her tighter, shielding her from the brunt of the wave, his body a solid wall against the icy onslaught. He pulled her back, away from the edge of the chasm, his movements swift and sure. "We must keep moving," he said, his voice urgent, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "The river is testing us. It will not give up its secrets easily." The near kiss, the wave, the renewed danger, it all served as a stark reminder of their precarious situation. They were not safe, not yet. The curse was still active, the river still a threat. Their personal feelings, the rekindled love, had to be set aside, at least for now. Eowyn nodded, her heart pounding, her body trembling both from the cold and from the lingering intensity of the moment. She forced herself to focus, to push aside the desire, the longing, and concentrate on the task at hand. They continued their perilous journey across the fracturing ice, their movements more cautious now, their senses heightened. The wolf, which had been following them closely, let out a low growl, its eyes fixed on a point further ahead, in the middle of the river. "What is it?" Eowyn asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Frostborn followed the wolf's gaze, his eyes narrowing. He could see it too. A faint shimmer in the ice, a distortion in the air, a sense of something hidden beneath the surface. "There," he said, his voice low and tense. "That is where the disruption lies. That is where we must go." The area he indicated was even more treacherous than the path they had already traversed. The ice was thinner, riddled with cracks, the water churning ominously beneath. It was a death trap, a place where one wrong step could mean certain doom. But they had no choice. They had to reach that point, had to uncover the source of the disruption, had to find a way to finally break the curse. They moved slowly, deliberately, testing each step before putting their full weight down. The ice groaned and cracked beneath them, the sound a constant reminder of the danger they faced. Eowyn could feel the Frostborn's tension, his muscles coiled tight, his senses alert to any sign of instability. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. It was a gesture of support, of solidarity, of love. A silent promise that they would face this together, no matter the outcome. He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of warmth in their silver depths. He didn't speak, but his gaze conveyed everything. He felt his gratitude, his determination, his love. As they drew closer to the shimmering area, Eowyn felt a strange sensation, a tingling in her skin, a buzzing in her ears. It was as if the very air were charged with energy, a palpable force that both repelled and attracted her. The ice beneath them grew thinner, more fragile. They could see the dark water swirling beneath, a chilling reminder of the fate that awaited them if they made a mistake. Suddenly, the ice beneath Eowyn's feet gave way. She cried out, her body plunging downwards, the icy water closing over her head. The shock was intense, stealing her breath. Chapter 13. Scars of the Past, Mirrored. The frigid water enveloped her, a suffocating embrace that stole her breath and numbed her senses. She struggled, her limbs flailing, her lungs burning for air. But the current was strong, pulling her down, dragging her away from the surface, from the light, from the Frostborn. She thought she was going to die. Then, a strong arm wrapped around her waist, a powerful grip that hauled her upwards, breaking the surface of the water, pulling her back into the air. It was him, the Frostborn. He had reacted instantly, diving in after her, his speed and strength defying the icy grip of the river. He held her close, his body shielding her from the churning water, his breath warm against her ear. "Yoin, are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern, his silver eyes searching her face. She gasped, coughing up water, her body shivering uncontrollably. "I think so," she managed to say, her voice trembling. He pulled her towards a larger, more stable section of ice, helping her to climb out of the water. The wolf was there, waiting, its fur bristling with concern. It nudged her hand with its head, a soft whimper escaping its throat. Yoin wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the shivering, but it was no use. The cold had penetrated her to the bone, a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep into her very soul. The Frostborn took off his long coat, the silvery gray material surprisingly dry despite his plunge into the river. He wrapped it around her, his touch gentle, caring. The coat was warm, imbued with his own body heat, and it slowly began to thaw her frozen limbs. "We must get you back," he said, his voice filled with concern. "You are freezing." But Eowyn shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her body. "We can't go back. We're so close. We have to finish this." She looked at the shimmering area in the ice, the source of the disruption, which was now only a few feet away. She could feel it, the energy emanating from it, a palpable force that pulsed with an ancient power. The Frostborn hesitated. He knew she was right, that they couldn't give up now. But he was also worried about her condition. She was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, her lips tinged with blue. "It's too dangerous," he said. "You could get hypothermia." "I'll be fine," she insisted, her determination unwavering. "We're almost there. We can do this." He studied her face, his silver eyes searching hers. He saw the strength in her gaze, the unwavering resolve, the echoes of the woman she had been, the woman he had loved. And he knew he couldn't deny her, couldn't stop her. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "All right," he said, "but we do this together. And we are careful." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. They approached the shimmering area, their steps slow and deliberate. The ice was incredibly thin here, almost translucent, the dark water swirling ominously beneath. As they reached the center of the shimmering area, Eowyn felt a surge of energy, a powerful force that seemed to emanate from the ice itself. She looked down and she saw it. Beneath the ice, embedded in the frozen riverbed, was an object. It was a dagger, its hilt crafted from bone, its blade made of a dark, shimmering metal that seemed to absorb the light. It pulsed with a malevolent energy, a dark power that radiated outwards, creating the disruption in the ice, the lingering hold of the curse. Eowyn recognized it. She had seen it before, in her visions, in her memories. It was the dagger that had been used to break the pact, the weapon that had unleashed the curse, the instrument of their separation. "That's it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and dread. "That's the source of the curse." The Frostborn nodded, his eyes fixed on the dagger. "We must remove it," he said. "But carefully. It is imbued with dark magic. It could be dangerous." He knelt down, his hand hovering over the ice, his fingers tracing the outline of the dagger. He closed his eyes, his face etched with concentration, and began to chant, his voice low and resonant, the words ancient and unfamiliar. Eowyn watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the energy building, the the power flowing between him, the dagger, and the ice. The air crackled with electricity, the ice beneath them groaning and cracking. The dagger began to glow. Chapter 14. The Unraveling Prophecy. The dagger pulsed with a dark, malevolent light, the energy radiating outwards in waves, making the ice around it vibrate and crack. Eowyn felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct to flee, to escape the dark power that was being unleashed. But she stood firm, her gaze fixed on the Frostborn, her trust in him unwavering. He continued to chant, his voice growing stronger, more resonant, his body surrounded by a faint, silvery aura. He was drawing on his own power, his connection to the ancient magic, to counteract the dark energy of the dagger. It was a battle of wills, a clash between light and darkness, a struggle for the fate of the village, of their future. Suddenly, the ice beneath the dagger shattered, creating a small opening in the frozen surface. The Frostborn reached out, his fingers hovering over the exposed hilt of the dagger. He hesitated for a moment, his face etched with concern. "This could be dangerous, Eowyn," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If I lose control, the dark magic could consume me." Eowyn nodded, her heart pounding. She knew the risk, had seen the potential consequences in her visions. But she also knew that they had no other choice. They had to remove the dagger, had to break its hold on the river, on their lives. "I trust you," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his. "I know you can do this." He held her gaze for a moment, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. Then, he took a deep breath and grasped the hilt of the dagger. A jolt of energy, visible as a flash of dark light, surged through him, his body convulsing, his face contorting in pain. He cried out, a raw, guttural sound that echoed across the frozen river. Eowyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She wanted to help him, to pull him away, to save him from the dark magic that was consuming him. But she knew she couldn't interfere. She had to trust him, had to let him fight this battle on his own. The wolf, which had been standing silently by her side, let out a low growl, its eyes fixed on the Frostborn, its body tense with concern. The Frostborn struggled, his body shaking, his face pale and strained. He was losing control, the dark magic of the dagger threatening to overwhelm him. Eowyn could see it in his eyes, in the way his silver light was flickering, dimming, being replaced by a dark, ominous glow. She had to do something, had to help him.
But what?
She didn't have his power, his connection to the ancient magic. She was just a woman who had rediscovered her past, a woman who loved him. Then she remembered. The ring. The silver ring with the ice-blue stone, the symbol of their broken pact, the key to their shared destiny. It was still in the pocket of the Frostborn's coat, the coat she was wearing. She reached into the pocket, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the ring. She pulled it out, holding it up to the moonlight, the ice-blue stone shimmering with an inner light. She didn't know what to do, how to use it.
But she knew she had to try.
She had to channel her love, her connection to him, her belief in their shared destiny. She closed her eyes, her mind focusing on the Frostborn, on the image of his face, his silver eyes, his strength, his love. She poured all her energy, all her emotions, into the ring, willing it to help him, to break the hold of the dark magic. "Alara!" He cried out again, his voice weaker now, his body trembling violently. Eowyn opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on him. She saw the darkness consuming him, the light fading from his eyes. She knew she had to act fast. She stepped forward, onto the shattered ice, her movements reckless, desperate. She reached out, her hand holding the ring, and touched the dagger. A surge of energy, a blinding flash of light, erupted from the point of contact. Eowyn cried out, her body thrown backwards, landing hard on the ice. The dagger shattered. Chapter 15. Betrayal in the biting air. The explosion of light subsided, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Eowyn lay on the ice, stunned, her body aching, her vision blurred. She blinked, trying to clear her head, trying to see what had happened. The dagger was gone. Shattered into a million pieces, its dark magic dissipated. The ice around the area where it had been was still fractured, but the ominous shimmering was gone. The sense of disruption, of malevolence, had vanished. She looked for the Frostborn, her heart pounding with fear. He was lying on the ice, a few feet away, motionless, his body surrounded by a faint, flickering aura. No, she cried out, scrambling to her feet, rushing to his side. She knelt down beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch him. His skin was cold, too cold, his breathing shallow and uneven. His eyes were closed, his face pale and strained. "Wake up," she pleaded, her voice choked with sobs. "Please, wake up." She cradled his head in her lap, stroking his hair, her tears falling onto his face. She couldn't lose him. Not now, not after they had come so far, not after they had found each other again. The wolf whimpered, nudging his hand with its head, its silver eyes filled with sorrow. Suddenly, a voice, cold and harsh, cut through the silence. "Foolish woman," the voice said, "you have destroyed the balance." Eowyn looked up, startled, her eyes widening in disbelief. Standing over them, his face contorted with rage, was Silas. He held a thick, wooden club in his hand, his eyes blazing with a fanatic light. "Silas?" Eowyn gasped, her voice barely a whisper. What are you doing?" "Saving the village," Silas said, his voice dripping with venom.
"From you."
"From him. From the curse." He raised the club, his intentions clear. He was going to attack the Frostborn, while he was unconscious, vulnerable. Eowyn reacted instantly, throwing herself over the Frostborn's body, shielding him from the impending blow. "No," she screamed. "Don't you dare." Silas hesitated, his eyes flickering with a momentary uncertainty. But then his face hardened, his resolve returning. "You are in league with him," he said. "You are part of the curse. You must be stopped." He swung the club, aiming for Eowyn's head. But before the blow could land, the wolf intervened, leaping forward, its teeth sinking into Silas's arm. Silas cried out in pain, dropping the club, his arm bleeding profusely. The wolf growled, its eyes fixed on Silas, its body tense, ready to attack again. Martha and several other villagers, who had been watching from the riverbank, rushed forward, their faces filled with shock and horror. They had seen everything: Eowyn's bravery, Silas's betrayal, the wolf's intervention. "Silas, what have you done?" Martha cried out, her voice trembling with disbelief. Silas, his face pale and contorted with pain, backed away, his eyes darting nervously between the wolf and the villagers. He's the enemy," he stammered. "He's the Frostborn. He's the one who brought the curse. He saved us." One of the villagers shouted. "He broke the curse." Eowyn helped him. Another added. They did it together. The villagers, their fear replaced by anger and disgust, turned on Silas, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. They had witnessed his treachery, his attempt to harm the very person who had saved them. Silas, realizing he was outnumbered, that he had lost all support, turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness, his cries of pain and anger echoing through the frozen night. Martha and the other villagers rushed to Eowyn's side, helping her to sit up, checking her for injuries. She was bruised and shaken, but otherwise unharmed. Her attention, however, was focused entirely on the Frostborn. He was still unconscious, his breathing shallow and uneven, his skin cold to the touch. "We need to get him back to the village," Eowyn said, her voice urgent. "He needs warmth. He needs care." The villagers, their initial fear and mistrust of the Frostborn replaced by gratitude and concern, helped her to lift him, carrying him carefully back to the village, their steps slow and deliberate. The wolf followed close behind. Chapter 16. The Weight of Unspoken Words. They carried him to Eowyn's cottage, laying him gently on her bed, covering him with thick blankets. Martha busied herself with building up the fire, her movements quick and efficient, her face etched with worry. The villagers, their initial fear and distrust replaced by a collective sense of responsibility, crowded into the small cottage, their eyes fixed on the unconscious Frostborn, their silence filled with a mixture of concern and hope. Eowyn sat beside him, holding his hand, her gaze fixed on his face. His skin was still cold, too cold, but his breathing had become slightly more regular, a faint flicker of color returning to his cheeks. She stroked his hair, whispering words of comfort, of encouragement, of love. The wolf lay at the foot of the bed, its silver eyes unwavering, its presence a silent vigil. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire, the soft murmur of the villagers' voices, and Eowyn's whispered pleas. The first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in hues of pale pink and gray, casting a soft light through the cottage window. Finally, as the sun began to rise, his eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. His silver eyes, initially unfocused, gradually cleared, focusing on Eowyn's face. "Alara?" he whispered, his voice weak, his gaze searching hers. "Yes," she whispered back, tears of relief welling up in her eyes. "It's me. You're safe now." He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, forcing him to lie back down. Eowyn gently pushed him back against the pillows. "Don't try to move," she said. "You're still weak." He looked around the room, his eyes taking in the villagers, the wolf, Martha bustling by the fire. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. What happened?" he asked, his voice still weak, his memory fragmented. Eowyn explained, telling him about Silas's betrayal, about the villagers' support, about the shattering of the dagger. She spoke softly, her voice filled with emotion, her hand never leaving his. He listened intently, his silver eyes darkening with anger as she described Silas's actions, his expression softening with gratitude as she spoke of the villagers' help. "He tried to kill you," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and fear. He couldn't finish the sentence, the thought too horrific to contemplate. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch gentle, reverent. "I am sorry," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "I brought this upon you. I brought this upon the village." Eowyn shook her head. "No," she said. "It wasn't your fault. It was the curse. And it's over now. We broke it. Together." He smiled, a faint, weary smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Together," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He closed his eyes, his body relaxing, his breathing becoming more regular. He was exhausted, drained by the ordeal, by the battle against the dark magic. He drifted back to sleep, his hand still holding Eowyn's. Martha, who had been watching them silently, approached Eowyn, her face filled with a mixture of relief and understanding. She placed a gentle hand on Eowyn's shoulder. "He'll be all right," she said, her voice soft. "He's strong. And he has you." Eowyn nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew Martha was right. He would recover. He was strong, resilient, and he was no longer alone. He had her, and she had him. But even as she felt a surge of relief, of hope, a shadow of doubt lingered in her heart. The curse was broken, yes, but the scars remained. The scars of the past, the scars of betrayal, the scars of separation. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that those scars would take time to heal. She looked at the sleeping Frostborn, at his peaceful face, his silver hair spread across the pillow. She loved him. She knew that with every fiber of her being. But she also knew that their journey was far from over. They had a long road ahead of them, a road filled with challenges, with uncertainties, with the weight of unspoken words, with the echoes of a past that still haunted them. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken feelings. Chapter 17. A flicker of hope in the darkness. The silence in the cottage was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of shared history and uncertain futures. Eowyn watched the Frostborn sleep, his chest rising and falling softly, his features relaxed in slumber. The villagers, Their initial fear and distrust replaced by a cautious respect had quietly dispersed, leaving Eowyn and Martha alone with him. Martha, ever practical, busied herself with preparing a broth, her movements quiet and deliberate, her presence a comforting anchor in the swirling emotions that filled the room. Eowyn, however, remained by the Frostborn's side, her hand resting lightly on his, her gaze fixed on his face. She studied him, tracing the lines of his features, the strong jawline, the high cheekbones, the silver hair that framed his face like a winter halo. She saw the echoes of the man she had loved in her past life, the man she had lost, the man she had found again. But she also saw the scars, the subtle lines of pain around his eyes, the faint weariness in his expression. She knew that the breaking of the curse had not erased the past, had not healed the wounds that centuries of separation and betrayal had inflicted. They had a long way to go, a journey of healing and rediscovery that would require patience, understanding, and courage. As if sensing her thoughts, he stirred, his eyelids fluttering, then slowly opening. His silver eyes, initially clouded with sleep, gradually focused on her face. "Alara," he whispered, his voice still weak, but filled with a warmth that sent a shiver of joy through her. "I'm here," she said, her voice soft, her hand squeezing his gently. He smiled, a faint, tentative smile that reached his eyes, a spark of light in the lingering shadows. He tried to sit up, but Eowyn gently restrained him.
"Easy," she said. "You need to rest."
Martha approached with a bowl of steaming broth, her expression softening as she saw that he was awake. "Here," she said, offering the bowl to Eowyn. "This will help you regain your strength." Eowyn helped him to sit up, propping him against the pillows, then held the bowl to his lips. He drank slowly, his eyes never leaving Eowyn's face. The warmth of the broth seemed to revive him, bringing a faint flush of color to his cheeks. As he finished, he looked at Martha, a flicker of gratitude in his silver eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice still weak but sincere. Martha nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're welcome," she said. "We're all glad you're all right." He turned his gaze back to Eowyn, his eyes filled with a question, a hesitant uncertainty that mirrored her own. What now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eowyn took a deep breath. It was the question that had been hanging in the air, the unspoken fear that lingered beneath the surface of their relief. The curse was broken, yes. But what did that mean for them? For their future? "Now," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart, "we rebuild. We heal. We rediscover each other." She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, her touch gentle, reverent. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment, as if savoring the simple contact, the warmth of her skin against his. "I have so much to tell you," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and longing. "So much to explain." Eowyn nodded. "And I have so much to learn," she said. "But we have time. We have all the time in the world." A flicker of hope, a spark of light, ignited in his silver eyes. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes, chasing away the shadows. "Together?" he asked, his voice filled with a newfound hope, a tentative belief in the possibility of a future. "Together," Eowyn confirmed, her voice unwavering, her heart filled with a love that transcended time and space, a love that had endured centuries of separation and betrayal, a love that was now, finally, free. The wolf, as if sensing their renewed hope, let out a soft bark. Chapter 18. The storm's relentless fury. The soft bark seemed to break a spell, a moment of fragile peace shattered by a sudden, violent gust of wind that rattled the windows of the cottage, making the flames in the hearth dance wildly. Eowyn and the Frostborn exchanged a look of alarm, a shared understanding that something was wrong. The air, which had been gradually warming, suddenly turned frigid, a biting chill that seeped into the very bones. The Frostborn struggled to sit up, his face etched with concern.
"What is it?"
Eowyn asked, her voice filled with apprehension. "The storm," he said, his voice grim. "It's intensifying." It's not natural. He looked out the window, his silver eyes narrowing. The sky, which had been clear and bright only moments before, was now darkening rapidly, heavy clouds swirling ominously, obscuring the sun. The wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed through the village. Martha, her face pale and strained, rushed to the window, peering out at the gathering storm. "It's worse than before," she said, her voice trembling. "It's like the curse is fighting back." Eowyn felt a surge of fear, a cold dread that gripped her heart. They had broken the curse, hadn't they? They had shattered the dagger, had renewed the pact. What was happening? The Frostborn pushed himself up, ignoring Eowyn's protests, his movements determined despite his weakness. He stood, swaying slightly, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the wall. "The dagger was the source of the curse," he said, his voice low and tense. But it was not the only source of its power. He looked at Eowyn, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of regret and apology. "There is something else," he said. "Something I did not tell you. Something I hoped I would never have to face again." Eowyn felt a chill that was colder than the wind, a premonition of something terrible, something that threatened to shatter their newfound hope. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze dropping, his face etched with pain. A part of me," he said, his voice strained. "A shadow self. A manifestation of the curse's darkness, of my own despair." He explained, his voice filled with self-loathing, how the curse had not only trapped him, but had also twisted him, creating a dark reflection of himself, a being of pure negativity, fueled by the pain and suffering of the broken pact. He had managed to suppress it, to keep it contained, but the shattering of the dagger, the sudden release of energy, had awakened it. "It is out there," he said, his gaze fixed on the swirling storm outside. "And it is growing stronger." The wind howled louder, shaking the cottage, rattling the windows, as if in response to his words. The temperature plummeted, the air growing so cold that their breath clouded in front of their faces. Eowyn felt a surge of despair, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. They had come so far, had overcome so much. Was it all for nothing? Were they destined to be forever trapped in this cycle of darkness and despair? But then, she looked at the Frostborn, at his face, etched with determination despite his fear, his silver eyes filled with a fierce resolve. And she knew they couldn't give up. They couldn't let the darkness win. "We'll face it," she said, her voice firm, her hand reaching out to take his. Together. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a gratitude that warmed her heart. He squeezed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Together," he confirmed, his voice echoing her earlier words, a promise, a vow, a testament to their unwavering bond. They stepped outside, into the raging storm, the wind whipping their hair, the snow stinging their faces. The village was deserted, the villagers huddled in their homes, their fear palpable in the air. The river, once again a solid sheet of ice, reflected the dark, swirling sky, creating a scene of utter desolation. And then they saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the frozen river, its silhouette stark against the swirling snow. It was tall and imposing, its form shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent, red light. It was the shadow self, the manifestation of the curse's darkness, the embodiment of the Frostborn's despair. It was everything he was not: cruel, vengeful, consumed by hatred and pain.
And it was waiting for them.
The storm raged. Chapter 19. The choice between two worlds. The shadow self stood on the ice, a figure of pure darkness, its red eyes burning with malevolent intent. The wind howled around it, whipping the snow into a frenzy, creating a vortex of swirling white that obscured its form, making it appear even more menacing, more otherworldly. Eowyn felt a surge of fear, a primal terror that threatened to paralyze her. But she stood firm, her hand gripping the Frostborns, her gaze fixed on the dark figure before them. She would not be broken. She would not let fear consume her. The Frostborn, his face etched with a mixture of determination and self-loathing, stepped forward, his silver eyes locking with the red eyes of his shadow self. "I will not let you harm them," he said, his voice ringing out across the frozen river, defying the howling wind. "I will not let you destroy what we have rebuilt." The shadow self laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the ice, sending shivers down Eowyn's spine. "You cannot stop me," it said, its voice dripping with venom. "I am a part of you. I am your darkness. I am your despair. And I will consume you." It raised its hands, and the wind intensified, the snow swirling faster, creating a blinding whiteout. Eowyn could barely see, her eyes stinging from the icy particles, her body buffeted by the relentless force of the gale. She felt the Frostborn's grip tighten on her hand, his presence a lifeline in the swirling chaos. She knew he was preparing to fight, to confront his shadow self, to protect her, to protect the village. But she also knew that he was weakened, still recovering from the ordeal of breaking the curse. He was not at full strength, and the shadow self, fueled by the lingering darkness of the curse, was growing stronger by the second. She had to do something, had to help him. But what? She was just a woman. She had no magic, no power to fight this creature of darkness. Then she remembered. The ring. It was still in the pocket of his coat. While it might not be an offensive weapon, it was certainly magical. She might be able to draw on it in some way, perhaps to shield them. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "The ring," she shouted over the howling wind, her voice barely audible. "I can help." He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. He knew what she was thinking, what she was planning. He nodded, his grip tightening on her hand. "Be careful," he said, his voice urgent. "It is dangerous." He stepped forward, facing his shadow self, his body tense, ready to fight. Eowyn slipped the ring onto her finger, closing her eyes, focusing. She drew a shaky breath. As she did, the shadow self lunged, its movements swift and deadly, its form a blur of darkness in the swirling snow. The Frostborn met its attack, his own movements surprisingly agile despite his weakened state. They clashed, their forms a tangle of light and darkness, their struggle a dance of death on the frozen river. The wind howled, the snow swirled, the ice groaned beneath their feet. Eowyn watched them, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had to find a way to help him, to tip the balance in his favor. She closed her eyes, focusing on the ring, on the connection she felt to the Frostborn, on the love that bound them together. She poured all her energy, all her emotions, into the ring, willing it to protect him, to shield him from the darkness. She felt a surge of power, a warmth that spread through her body, emanating from the ring, creating a faint, shimmering aura around her. She opened her eyes and she saw it. A faint, silvery shield, forming around the Frostborn, deflecting the shadow self's attacks, protecting him from the brunt of its force. It wasn't enough. The shield was weak, flickering, threatening to collapse under the relentless assault of the shadow self. But it was a start. It was a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. The Frostborn, sensing the shield, seemed to draw strength from it, his movements becoming more fluid, more powerful. He fought with renewed vigor, his silver eyes burning with a fierce determination. The battle raged on, a desperate struggle between light and darkness, between hope and despair. The fate of the village, of their future, hung in the balance, suspended on the outcome of this epic confrontation. Eowyn knew she had to do more. She looked down at the river. She looked at the ring. She closed her eyes, focusing all her will, thinking of their connection, his goodness. She made a decision. She stepped forward towards the fight. She held out her hand towards the Frostborn. "Take it," she yelled, hoping he could both see and understand. He looked, met her eyes, and with a nod, grabbed her hand. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts. As their hands met, the ring flared with a brilliant, blinding light, a surge of pure energy that erupted outwards, engulfing them both, pushing back the swirling snow, creating a dome of warmth and light in the heart of the storm. The shadow self recoiled, hissing, its red eyes flickering with rage and fear. The Frostborn, empowered by the ring, by Eowyn's love, by their shared connection, stood tall, his silver eyes blazing with a power that rivaled the storm itself. He was no longer just fighting his shadow self, he was fighting for his future, for their future, for the hope of a life free from the curse, free from the darkness. "This ends now," he said, his voice ringing out across the frozen river, his words carrying the weight of centuries, the promise of redemption. He lunged, his movements swift and decisive, his attacks infused with the power of the ring, with the strength of their love. The shadow self, weakened by the light, by the force of their combined will, struggled to defend itself, its form flickering, its red eyes dimming. The battle raged on, but the tide had turned. The Frostborn, fueled by Eowyn's love, by their shared destiny, was gaining the upper hand. He pressed his attack, forcing the shadow self back, driving it towards the edge of the ice, towards the churning water below. Eowyn watched, her heart pounding, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. She knew this was the final confrontation, the decisive moment that would determine their fate. She poured all her remaining energy into the ring, willing it to sustain the light, to empower the Frostborn, to banish the darkness forever. Finally, with a powerful blow, the Frostborn struck the shadow self, sending it reeling backwards, its form dissolving into the swirling snow, its red eyes extinguished, its malevolent presence banished from the world. Silence descended, a sudden, profound silence that was broken only by the soft whisper of the wind, the gentle lapping of the water against the ice. The storm had passed, the clouds parting to reveal a clear, starlit sky, the moon shining brightly, casting a silver glow over the frozen river. The Frostborn stood, his body swaying slightly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was exhausted, drained by the battle, but his silver eyes shone with a light that was brighter than ever before, a light of victory, of peace, of love. He turned to Eowyn, his gaze softening, his expression filled with a tenderness that melted her heart. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, reverent. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse, but filled with emotion. "We defeated the darkness. Together." Eowyn smiled, tears streaming down her cheeks, tears of relief, of joy, of love. "Together," she confirmed, her voice choked with emotion. They stood there, on the frozen river, beneath the starlit sky, their hands clasped together, their hearts intertwined, their love a beacon of hope in the aftermath of the storm. The curse was broken, the darkness banished, their future uncertain, but filled with the promise of a new beginning. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their bond, that spoke of a love that had endured centuries of separation, of betrayal, of despair. It was a kiss of hope, of healing, of a future filled with warmth and light. As they broke apart, they heard the sound of cheering, of clapping, of voices raised in celebration. The villagers, who had been watching from the riverbank, their fear replaced by awe and gratitude, were rushing towards them, their faces lit up with joy, their hearts filled with relief. Martha was at the front, her eyes shining with tears, her smile radiant. She embraced Eowyn, then the Frostborn, her gratitude overflowing. "You saved us," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us all." The villagers surrounded them, their cheers echoing across the frozen river, their faces filled with a newfound hope, a renewed belief in the power of love, in the possibility of redemption. The Frostborn, his arm around Eowyn, looked at the celebrating villagers, his heart filled with a warmth he had not felt in centuries. He had been the Frostborn, the keeper of the balance, the embodiment of winter. But now he was something more. He was free. He was loved. He was home. He looked down at Eowyn and smiled. Epilogue. The spring that followed was unlike any Oakhaven had ever seen. The snow melted quickly, revealing a landscape bursting with life, with vibrant colors, with a sweet scent of blossoms and the cheerful song of birds. The river, freed from the curse's icy grip, flowed freely, its waters sparkling in the sunlight, its gentle murmur a constant reminder of the peace that had been restored. Eowyn and the Frostborn, who now went by the name he had borne in their past life, Lyre lived in Eowyn's cottage, their days filled with a quiet joy, a gentle rhythm of shared moments, of rediscovering each other, of building a new life together. They walked hand in hand through the village, their presence a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the power of love. The villagers, their initial fear and distrust long forgotten, greeted them with smiles, with gratitude, with a respect that bordered on reverence. They were no longer just Eowyn and the Frostborn, they were Eowyn and Lyre, the couple who had saved Oakhaven, the couple who had brought warmth back to their lives. Lyre, freed from the curse, was no longer the cold, distant figure he had once been. He was warm, gentle, his silver eyes filled with a love that shone brightly, a love that was reflected in Eowyn's own. He learned to laugh again, to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, to embrace the warmth of human connection. He used his powers, his connection to the natural world, not to control, but to nurture, to heal, to protect. Eowyn, in turn, blossomed, her spirit renewed, her heart filled with a joy she had never thought possible. She rediscovered her own strength, her own resilience, her own capacity for love. She was no longer just the widow, the lonely woman who had found solace in the cold. She was a Lara, reborn, a woman who had faced her past, who had embraced her destiny, who had found her soulmate again. They often visited the ancient grove, the place where their story had begun, where the pact had been made, where the curse had been broken. They would stand before the standing stones, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude for the second chance they had been given. Silas, banished from the village, was never seen again, a cautionary tale whispered among the villagers, a reminder of the dangers of fear, of prejudice, of the darkness that could consume even the most ordinary of hearts. Martha remained Eowyn's closest friend, her confidant, her unwavering support. She often visited the cottage, sharing meals, laughter, and stories with Eowyn and Lyre, her presence a comforting reminder of the bonds of friendship, of the strength of community. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Eowyn and Lyre sat on the porch of their cottage, watching the river flow by. Lyre reached out and took Eowyn's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I never thought," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a love that made Eowyn's heart swell, "that I would find happiness again. That I would find you." Eowyn smiled, her eyes meeting his, her heart overflowing with a love that transcended time and space, a love that had endured centuries of separation, of betrayal, of despair. "And I," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "never thought I would find a love like this again. A love that completes me." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their bond, that spoke of a future filled with hope, with warmth, with the promise of a love that would last for eternity. The river flowed, the wind whispered, and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a silent testament to their enduring love, a love that had conquered darkness, a love that had brought spring to Oakhaven, a love that had healed two hearts, forever bound. The breeze was gentle and filled with the scent of wildflowers.